Hello guys and welcome back. So in this video we're going to implement the media sources to bring the data to the media browser service compact here. So in the last video we created here our .source factories and exoplayer, and we used a service module here using Dagger Hilt and we injected. So if you have not seen the previous video, check the link in the description box. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, now we can just come here to our media package here and create a new package, and we can just call this exoplayer. And inside this exoplayer here, we can just create a new coding class or file. And this one, we are just going to call it media source. So now we can just inject this and we can pass in here a repository. Okay, so now here what we want to do, we want to allow the client or the use of this class, which is going to be our media player service compact. So we can just create a link or a token between this, and the good way is just creating callbacks. And for our case here, we can just come here and create a type alias class. And this one, we're just going to call it already listener. And this one is just going to be of type Boolean, returning a unit. So type alias in Kotlin means a way to give an existing type a new name. So it provides an alternative naming to your existing type to reflect a more readable code. So we are just going to use this Lambda function here to communicate to our media player service compact here. And in order to do that, we have to create this function here. So we can just add this type alias here to give the name to this Boolean function, so that when we just pass this already listener, we can just understand that we are just going to use this already listener. And for that case here, now we can just come and create our variable, which is going to keep up the listeners. And here basically now we have created a mutable list of unread listeners, which we're just going to receive from our media player service. Okay, so now we want to create a state that is going to help us to decide when our media data are going to be fully loaded or if they are not loaded. So we can just come below this class here and create an enum class. And here we have several states. So for example, here we're just going to have a state created. So basically here we're just going to see if the state is going to be created, and here is when the state has not fully loaded our media data, and here it is now loading the data, and here also it's just already finished to load the data, and here we have an error. So for that case we can just change this state whenever we want. Okay, now here we want to create our state. Let's create first a little room here. Okay, so here we want to create a state variable, so we can just create here a private var. And this one is just going to be of audio state. And for our initial step here is just going to be audio state created. And we're just creating this variable here because these already listeners are going to be executed inside our media player service. And at most it's just going to be executed on when we're just returning the child to the client. So for example, when we are sending data back to the activity, so from the service to the activity, so we are just going to use these already listeners to send the data. And also we're just, when we are preparing the media for playback, so we're just going to use these already listeners in order to execute this data. And for that case, we must be in a state that we have already initialized the sources, so we can just disallow to send these media sources or media data when we have not fully loaded. And this is just the purpose of this state here. And now we want to check this state here. We can pass in here a set value, and inside here now we can just check if, for example, our value which we are just coming here to set is going to be the audio source state created. So we can just pass it here. Or if we are just getting an error here, we are passing an error value. Okay, so now here we want to initialize our variables, and here this already listener is going to be executed in a background thread. So for example, when we are just preparing the media ID or when we are just returning the data to the client, and for this case, this is going to be executed in multiple threads. So in order to keep the state in sync, we have to use a concept which is called synchronization. So we can just call here synchronized, and here basically we can just unlock these already listeners so that we can easily modify the state inside a single thread. So we can just pass in here the field, and we can just initialize this to a value which we are just going to pass here. So if you don't know about synchronization, so synchronization helps in keeping the state, the same state across the threads. So when we have multiple threads, then we can just keep the same state across threads. So you can picture this as a bathroom that one person enters and then locks that bathroom. So for our case here, it's just the already listeners is going to lock the bathroom. Then here inside this curly braces here where we have our block, then we are just going to poop, or we can just execute here our things which we are just going to do. Then after that, when we finish up here, this already listeners is going to open up, so another thread can just enter here again and get the same value. And for that case, we have our value initialized in a single thread and in a thread safe manner. Okay, and now for that case here, we want to pass in here the listeners, and we can use on each of these listeners. And now here we can just change these listeners. So we're just going to loop through all of these commands which have been sent from the media player service so that we can just invoke them here. So we're just going to see how we can use these methods here in our lead listeners. So we can just pass in this listener and we can just invoke here. And here we are required to pass in a boolean. And here we can just create a function. And we can just call this is ready. And then this one is going to return a boolean. And here we can just provide a get function here. And what we want to do, we can just check if this state is going to be in a state initialized. So if we are in a state that we have already initialized, so we can just pass in here is ready. And for this case here, we have just changed the value, and also we have passed to these listeners that this media source is just ready. You can try to use them. And otherwise that we have passed in here an else statement. And here basically we can just set the field to the value which is coming. Okay, now here we have finished to set up our state. Now let's create here a function that is going to help us to get these already listeners or these actions here to execute them here. Now we can just create here a little room. And for our case here, we can just create a function and we can call this one ready. And this type here must return a boolean. Okay, now inside here, we can just return and we can just check if this one is just going to be in a certain state. So for our case here, we can just check the state. If this one is just going to be to the audio source state created. Okay, so basically here we are checking if our state is going to be either in a state created or in a state initializing. So our media source is not ready. And for this case here, we can just pass in here the already listeners which we have so that we can just structure them to be used later. And what we have to do here, we can just add this data and we can just pass in here the listener. And otherwise here we can just pass in false because we have not finished to load our data. And else here now we can just check this, we have already fully loaded, so we can just pass in here the listeners and we can just invoke this function and we can just check if this one is going to be ready. And for that case also we can just pass in here to be true. Okay, so we have created here when ready. This function here is going to be accessed here from our media player service. So we are just going to pass in here the listeners or the things or actions which we want to execute them here. And first case, we are just going to check if our state is either created or initializing. And for this case here, our media is not fully loaded. So what we have to do, we have to queue these listeners in order to come to execute them when we have finished to load them. And we have to tell the client that this is not fully loaded by passing in here false. Otherwise that our state is loaded and our media source are ready. Now we can just call this listener here and invoke and pass in to check if this is just been either loaded or not. So it could be in a state of an error. So we can just tell this it's just going to be in an error state here by invoking it and not just queuing it inside here listeners. Okay, so this can be a little bit confusing, but take your time. If you have not understood this, you can just really watch again this part. As you can see here, we are just creating these ready listeners here in order to queue the actions from the media browser service so that we can just execute them when our state is ready. And here, basically, we are just creating our state. And the first instance here, our state is going to be created, because we are just not going to be having the data loaded. And for this case here, now we are just going to check when we want to set in this value, and then we are just going to see it in a moment when we are going to load the values. So we're just going to set this value here. If this one is just going to be either in these two states here, either created or error, then we can just come here to use this synchronization here. And this synchronization is going to help us to keep the state across multiple threads, so that we can just execute this on ready listeners and change the state here only once, so not on multiple threads. And for that case here, we can just loop around all of those ready listeners, and we can just check if this one is going to be ready. And we defined here a function that if this one is going to be ready, as you can see here, we are just going to check the state. If this state is going to be equal to state initialized, and for that case, we can just return this and invoke the functions which we have been queuing them. Otherwise, that our state is neither in these two states here, so we can just set the values to the state to this value which we are going to set here. Now let's implement a method that is going to help us to load the media source from the repository. Okay, now let's create here a suspend function. So this function here is going to be called load and help us to load the data. And basically here now we can just get our data, and we can just call the repository. Now what we want to do here, we want to transform this data, because here we have our audio data. So this audio data is not recognized by the media player service and the exo player. So we want to transform this to a metadata that can be easily recognized. So we can just come here and create a function, a variable. Now here we can just create a variable. So we can just call this audio media metadata. And this one is just going to be of list. And then we just want to pass in here the media metadata compact. And basically now we can just initialize this first time to be an empty list. And for that case, we can just come here to get our audio metadata. So we can just reinitialize this, and then we can just get this data, and we want to map this data to what this audio metadata understands here. And here basically we can just use the media metadata compact. And for this case here, we want to put the string. Okay, we can just rename this to audio. So here basically now we want to use the metadata in order to transform these functions. So we can just use this media metadata. And for example, here we can just keep in here the ID. And basically now we can just pass in here the ID. Okay, so basically here we can just do this to the rest of the item which we have. And here basically now we can just change this from here, but we can put the album artist. And here basically now we can just put the long. Okay, so basically here now we have just get our data, and then we have transformed this to the media metadata compact, which is just understood by our media player. Okay, now here we can just reinitialize our state here. So for example, here we are just going to be in a state of initializing. So we can just use this audio state, and here we are initializing our state. And after we just transform this data here, now we can just tell that our data is ready to use. So we can just put in here the state initialized. So as you have seen here, now we have changed the state here. So we can just inform that this one has already been initialized, and then we can just call this on ready listeners here for our case, because the data has already been fully loaded here. Okay, so we have made here our data fetched, so it is fully loaded. And what we want to do here is to provide the function that is going to transform these media metadata items being playable by the player. And for our case here, our player is exo player, so we can just create here a little room, and here we can just create a new function, and this function is going to be called as media source. And this one function is going to take up a data source factory, and this function here is going to return a concatenating media source. Now here we can create here a concatenating media source. So basically we want to play our item when first item finishes to play the next item, and this is just like similar to a playlist structure. So for that case, we're just using this concatenating media source for that case. And here now we can just get our audio data, And we can just loop around to get every item here. Okay, now what we want to do here is to get the media item, because this concatenating data source requires us to pass in here the media item. And for this case here, we can just call the media item, and we can easily create here a media item. So we can just come here and create a media item, and you have to select this com.google.android exoplayer. And basically here now we can call from URI. And because here we have a URI, we can just call here a media, we can just call here our media metadata, and we can just get a string here. So basically here now we have just passed in here our URI, which we want to get it. Also, we want to create here a media source. So we can just create here a variable, and we can just call this media source. And here we want to make a progressive media source that is going to help us to get the data. So we can just call this progressive media source. And basically here now we are just going to pass in here the factory. And for our case here, we can just pass that data source factory, which we have passed there. And then we can just set here the media source. So here we are just going to add the media sources, and we can just call here our concatenating media source. And we can just add here our media source. And for that case here, now we can just return here our media source. Okay, so basically here we have just creating here a concatenating media source, and inside this our audio metadata we have fetched the media item, which is just recognized in exoplayer in order to play a media item. And here what we have done, we have added here progressive media source that is going to use the data source factory here to fetch the data. And also we have created this media source by using this media item here. And for that case, we have added this inside our concatenating media source and return this data, which is going to be used by the exoplayer in order to play those multiple items which we have added inside here. Okay, now here our media player has a data source that it can easily play. So what we want to create here is another function that is going to give us the media data, which is going to be returned by the media browser service. So when we are sending data back to the client, we have to send the media item which is suitable for display. And this one is just suitable for playing, and we want to create a media item that is suitable for displaying. So we can just create here another function, and we can just call this. And basically here now we can just use this audio metadata, and we can just map it. So we can just create here a function which is called description. So we are just going to use here media description compact, and this one is just Android support.vision4.media. And basically here now we can just call the builder. Okay, what we want to do here, we want to set the title. We can just transform this to be metadata. And here basically we can just pass in here the media ID. Also we can pass in here the media URI. So basically these are the data which are going to be used when we want to display our item. So you can just use this media browser compact here, and we can just create here a media item. And easily here now we can just pass in here the description, and we can just pass in here a flag which is going to be flag playable. And we can just put this, and we can just put in here the media browser compact here version 4. And for this case here now we can just transform this to mutable list. And for that case here, we have our media item, which is going to be used by our media browser service to send the data back to the client when it wants to display. And here basically now we can just create a function that is going to help us to refresh. Now we can just use these already listeners here, and we can just clear them. And for this case, we can just pass in here our state back to be audio. Okay, so finally here our media source is complete. So don't get confused here. We are just using here a media item. This one is just going to be used by the media browser service to return the data to the client, and this one is just going to be used suitable for display, and here this one is just suitable for playing, and this one is just going to be used by ExoPlayer. So you're just going to see this in action when we try to implement this inside our media player service. Okay, now here we can just inject our variable, and we can create here another letInit variable, and for this case we are just going to call our media source. And for that case, let's try to rebuild here and see if we don't have any error. So guys, our project has finished up to build successfully. So let's leave it here for this video. If you're getting value out of these videos, please don't forget to provide a like and subscribe. So in the next video, we will finish setting up our media service. Stay tuned. See you in the next video. Bye bye for now.